the foundation sits on the land of the Massachusetts and the Wampanoag peoples. The Nellie Mae Education Foundation is committed to championing efforts to prioritize community goals that challenge racial inequities and advance excellent student-centered public education for all New England learners. But before we get to today's conversation, I just want to share a couple of housekeeping tips that might answer some of the questions you have in mind. As you can tell, we are recording, and later today, you will receive an email from us that contains the resources that will be referenced during today's conversation. The comments are turned off. However, the Q&A chat is on, and we really encourage everyone to make use of that. The captions feature is available for you to use, and we would like to take a moment to thank Beth Anderton from Joyful Signing, who will be providing American Sign Language interpretation for us. So let's get to the meat of this conversation. Although COVID-19 public health emergency ended in May, I think that most of us can look around and still feel its multi-layered impact for students. Unfinished learning added to the challenges they were already facing. And research indicates that the level of unfinished learning is significant, especially for young people of color, multilingual learners, children with special needs, and for those that live in under-resourced communities and other young people. However, you may also notice that the students that I have mentioned have already been systematically underserved. To address this and other needs, the Biden administration made billions of dollars available as part of the American Rescue Plan. Although the funds were released in 21, there is still time and there are still resources that can be allocated to support students. When the funds were announced, Secretary of Education, Dr. Miguel Cardona, emphasized the need and the importance of involving community members in the decision-making processes. Of course, for some districts and community members, this meant doing business in a whole new way. Over the next hour, we will hear from our partners at the Education Trust, Young Voices, and the Vermont NEA. We are also very excited to hear some remarks from Dr. Lane, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education. You will hear about how these organizations build public awareness about the funds, how they engage with community members and with districts and city administrators, and about the research that was conducted to identify promising practices to support unfinished learning. So for most of us, talking about federal policy and billions of dollars is not an everyday topic, and wrapping our heads around the possibilities takes effort. But to truly lean into Secretary Cardona's request that the community be engaged in the process, we found that we needed to start by demystifying the ESSER funds. We identified 6 organizations that had taken up the challenge and were already busy engaging community members, including the students themselves. And just keep in mind that they were doing all this during the height of the pandemic. Today, you're going to hear from some of this from 2 organizations, but I would like to just give you a little glimpse of what other organizations also did. Several of them created toolkits and other tools that help people understand the ESSER funds. Some of these tools were translated to Spanish to make them even more accessible. In Portland, Maine, Portland Empower provided parents and young people training on participatory budgeting so that they could engage, they could be well equipped to engage with their districts and the city on these budgets. All of the 6 grantees hosted virtual and in-person forums to build the public's awareness of the funds that they share, and they shared the EdTrust evidence-based promising practices. I just also, again, want to note that I know I was very nervous during those times of the pandemic, so I really want to salute these organizations that somehow found the bandwidth to take this under their belt and to start creating tools for their communities. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to Nicholas from the EdTrust so that you can hear more about their practices and an update about the funds. Nicholas, thank you for joining us today.
Adelia, thanks for having me. I'm Nicholas Munyon-Penny. I'm the Assistant Director of Policy at the Education Trust, where I focus on assessments and accountability, as well as our work addressing ESSER funding and addressing the inequities that have resulted from the pandemic, and will be continuing after. So I'm going to start by giving a quick overview of the funding, talk about sort of how much money has been spent, what we know about what, and then think about sort of where are the places where advocates can really be digging in to make sure that the money that's left and time that we have left is being spent in the best way possible to address the needs of students. So as Delia mentioned, the ESSER funding, or Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, is a large amount of money. It was $189.5 billion that was funded through the federal government over the course of a couple of years. The latest amount came from the American Rescue Plan that was passed under President Biden. And states have until September 30th of next year, 2024, to spend that money. States and districts really have a lot of flexibility in how they can spend that money. Most of it went directly to districts for them to be addressing the needs of students, particularly at the beginning, to make sure that students were getting back into the classroom, and then to make sure that we were providing the resources that students need to address unfinished learning. And as I mentioned, states really have a lot of flexibility in how those funds are spent. And so it's really up to districts and states, as well as community members, to be working together to make sure that those funds were being spent in a way that was really impacting those students who needed it the most, targeting it to those funds. So what we know about how much money has been spent, since we know that the deadline is fast approaching, we know right now that based on federal estimates that a little over half of the total amount of money has been spent. And while that sounds like a lot, given the fact that we only have just over a year to spend the rest, that's a lot of money to be spent in just about a year. For instance, we know in Vermont and Rhode Island, two states that are represented here today, in Vermont, just according to the latest federal data, just 16% of the latest American Rescue Plan funds have been spent, and in Rhode Island, just about 18% have been spent. However, these figures sometimes don't tell the whole story. We know that what it means by spent can mean different things for different people as they're reporting it, and it's not always clear what that means. So being spent could mean that it's already been sort of out the door, checks have been written and cashed, but it could also just mean that it's in the budget, or that we sort of signed a contract saying that we're going to spend this money that hasn't been spent. Typically, the federal estimate is that first one where the check has actually been signed, and so more money than these small percentages are likely already obligated to certain expenses, even though they're not showing up that way in the data. So just something to be thinking about. And again, across states, it's very different. So it's definitely hard to get a full picture about how much money is being spent. We do know there's still a lot of money to be spent. That being said, we know from the Economics Lab in Georgetown that the pace of spending has really been increasing over the past couple of years. At the beginning, when this money was first available, states and districts were sort of trying to figure out how they wanted to spend that money, or slowly ramping up programs that they were trying to implement. And now that pace has really been increasing. So folks are optimistic that even though there's a lot of money left to be spent, that it will be spent by the deadline. And that's really important because we're still a little bit of uncertainty about what will happen at the end of that period. One thing that we do know that's really important is that the debt ceiling deal that was just passed in Congress and signed by President Biden over the weekend that allowed it for the federal government not to shut down. One of the things that was in that bill was that Republicans wanted to claw back unspent money from COVID relief packages. And so there was a lot of concern that this might actually impact schools and districts that don't spend that money in time. But we heard the department actually just sent a letter to governors, to the National Government Association, to reassure folks that that money is not going to be pulled back. All ESSER funds are technically obligated to states and districts, and so won't be part of that money that's coming back. What's a little bit less clear is what would happen if there's money unspent after the September deadline. So really what the focus needs to be right now at the state and district level and at the school level is making sure that we are spending that money before that deadline and thinking about how we can spend it well. So making sure that we're spending it equitably and on things that are impactful. And we definitely have a lot less information at the national level and even sometimes at the state and local level about how that money is actually being spent. But EdTrust in particular has been focusing on sort of some promising practices within this work that I think is important to highlight about how the money could be spent well, and as well as some examples of states that are doing and states and districts that are doing that really well. So one really important practice that we have been emphasizing since the beginning of the pandemic is targeted intensive tutoring. It is probably one of the most impactful interventions that we can be doing with students to make sure that they're able to catch up and have their learning accelerated so that they are able to access and understand grade level content. And there's some particularly important practices within that are important to do. We need to be doing it in small groups with trained tutors that are getting feedback. We need to be doing it ideally during the school day and regularly throughout the year. So for at least 30 minutes, multiple times throughout the week, throughout the year. Those types of practices are going to ensure that students are getting the most impact and that they're going to see the most academic growth from these investments. But we know that it can be really difficult to implement these practices with fidelity given the realities on the ground, particularly around staffing and scheduling. And so one district that we sort of looked at was Nashville, has been doing a really good job when it comes to implementing targeted intensive tutoring. And two things I think are really important to highlight is one, that they have really focused on ensuring that they're focusing on the quality of that tutoring rather than the quantity. So obviously there are tons of students in the district that would benefit from tutoring, but it's really about sort of knowing that you only have a limited number of slots to do it right. So it's really about targeting those students who need the services the most based on available data, including assessment data, including and other data as well. And the other really important thing is making sure that we're engaging the community around these practices so that folks are aware that they're happening and can give input around sort of when they're able to, making sure the programs are going to be offered when folks are able to actually attend. Another important thing would be extending learning time. So tutoring usually happens during the day, but there are also opportunities to extend the school day or the school year to provide additional learning time for students who need it in order for them to address the unfinished learning. And it's really important that when we do this, that we're not just having sort of like, oh, we're going to extend the school day and without having sort of clear goals about what's going to be happening during that time. So it's really important to be having clear goals. So we're going to be focusing on reading, or we're going to be focusing on math, and making sure that we're actually making that time mandatory for students and targeting it again to students who need it most. That's something that Dallas in Texas did really, really well. They actually piloted both the extended school day and the extended year in different schools and are looking to make sure that they targeted those in the schools that sort of had the most need and also were able and ready to do that work. And then compared the results from each of those options to sort of see which one had the most impact. Another thing that's really important to be thinking about across all of this work is making sure that we're creating environments that are safe and equitable for students. That's going to make sure that they're actually coming and attending to school, are feeling welcome. So we're not doing those things, building strong relationships with students and engaging the community in what students need to feel safe, and having sort of an asset-based frame when we're thinking about what students know and can do. If we aren't sort of starting there, we're not going to be able to get to the other important pieces about addressing unfinished learning. And so I think, again, one thing to really underscore here is the importance of community engagement, making sure that we're talking to students, we're talking to families, we're talking to folks that run community-based organizations to make sure we're all able to work together to address student needs. So as a part of the American Rescue Plan, this community engagement was actually required as states and districts were building their plans. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of evidence that was more sort of like just like a box checking exercise and wasn't actually really meaningful engagement. And we heard from the National Parents Union. They've been doing national polling throughout the pandemic and afterwards to get a sense of how parents are experiencing this. And they heard that just about 21% of parents said that their schools we're actually getting input about how the funds should be spent. And among those from lower income families, those made less than $50,000 a year, it was just 17% that they were asked for feedback. So we know that at the beginning of this process, this sort of really important community engagement wasn't happening. So it's important that folks in the community, like those folks that like Andrew and Peter will be talking about, are really pushing the districts to be talking and engaging with community members so that we're ensuring that the services that are provided are actually meeting students' needs. And so right now, there's really an important area to be focusing on. As I mentioned, the deadline for spending this money is coming up really quick. And so we need to be thinking about not just sort of how we're spending the money in the short term, but how this is addressing longer term needs. Because we know that inequities long predated the pandemic. They were exacerbated during the pandemic and are going to exist once this money is gone. So it's really thinking about sort of where are we going to go from here? That's really a way for communities and districts to be working together to be thinking about this. In particular, we should be looking at are the students with the most needs getting access to the programming and investments that we've already invested in? We know that certain students were more impacted by the pandemic than others, but it's important to make sure that we're actually getting those services to those students. For instance, if we're offering after-school programming, are the students actually getting that access to that program, or should that be something that we're shifting during the school day, so students are actually able to get to those programs? The other thing is that we really want communities should be really pushing districts to talk about whether these programs that they've done so far are actually having an impact for students. So obviously, looking at the summative assessment data at the end of the year is really helpful in the long term, but in the short term, as we're sort of trying to make adjustments and figure out what's working, we need to be looking at other things as well. We need to be looking at making sure that we're implementing these programs with fidelity, with the best practices, like I mentioned, during targeted intensive tutoring. So looking at sort of who's participating, who's actually staffing the program, do we have, when is it scheduled during the day, what's the curriculum that's there, those understanding, having data and collecting that on each of those pieces of implementation is going to be important for us doing long-term planning. Additionally, we should be looking at sort of some short-term outcomes, things like academic growth over the short term, maybe through interim assessments, looking at attendance data, maybe looking at discipline rates, depending on sort of what the intervention is that you're trying to address. And then thinking about if we're making progress, or if we're not making progress, maybe we should be, before this deadline is up, reinvesting that money somewhere else where it's going to be more impactful, or potentially improving implementation of the program. And if we are making progress, fantastic. Then we need to be thinking about how do we make sure that this program that's doing a good job for students is able to continue after this money ends. Maybe that's thinking about other state or federal funds that could help continue this, or maybe that's figuring out a way of moving it into the regular budget, or maybe it's a combination of doing those things and then potentially shrinking the program, but making sure that we're targeting it to students who need it most. And again, this should be a conversation that districts are having with students, families, staff, because those folks have really good information that they can share about how these programs are actually being implemented and how they're actually being felt on the ground. And that data, that sort of information is invaluable. And then finally, really want to be thinking about sort of like, what's the long-term vision for this? How does this fit into sort of how we're meeting the needs of students overall? So again, these are sort of really important things that we need to be focusing on as we're sort of moving forward, making sure that we are addressing these needs, making sure that we're making progress towards our goals, and making sure that we're planning for the future once this money ends, because we know that there's going to be a lot of inequities that exist after this ends. And EdTrust is going to be putting out a brief that sort of goes over all of this summer, so look forward to that. And then as we get closer to budget season in the winter, we'll be putting out some additional resources that provide advocates with specific questions they can be asking, to making sure that we're thinking about long-term planning when it comes to budgeting specifically. And with that, I will turn it back over to Delia to dive into our discussion.
Oh, I was on mute. And Nicholas, thank you so much. Thank you for all the great information you provided. And we will definitely be following up with folks with some resources, especially when that brief comes out that you mentioned. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. James Lane, who's here representing the Department of Education, and look forward to hearing your words and your perspective from where you sit. Thank you, Dr. Lane.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. It's great to be with everyone, and look forward to talking about our work on the American Rescue Plan and the ESSER funds as well. Again, I'm James Lane. I lead the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education at the U.S. Department of Education. And OESC, as we call it, leads our work on the American Rescue Plan, the ESSER Fund, all of our discretionary grant programs like full service community schools. We also lead our work on the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, plus all of the formula grant programs, including Title I, II, III, IV, and many, many other projects, including assessment and accountability. I think one of the things I always like to mention is I came here from the field. I was a state superintendent, a district superintendent, a principal, a teacher, and we're really intentional about making sure the work that we do has direct impact on improving the lives of our students. When we came into office, we inherited one of the greatest crises to ever face public schools. More than half of America's schools were closed, and it was important that we got all of our schools open. And so beginning day one, the president directed us to work aggressively and urgently to foster a strong educational recovery. In the first days of the administration, we issued clear guidance for safe school operations. And when we got into office with 47% of schools open, just a few months later, we had nearly every school open. And we think a lot of that is because of the passage of the American Rescue Plan. But the American Rescue Plan was not just about opening schools. It was also about ensuring that we had the funding necessary to support our districts on a robust academic recovery. And so our states and districts are responding. We now have evidence that our school districts are on track to expend all of these funds on time and on the right things. While ARP only requires that they spend 20% of their funds to address academic recovery and learning loss and accelerating learning, actual spending in this area is potentially nearly 3 times that. Nearly 60% of ARP ESSER funds are committed to investments like staffing, tutoring, after school and summer learning, new textbooks, learning materials, and mental and physical health supports. Many of the expenses that we just heard about from Nicholas in the previous speech. And we believe they're spending smartly. Future Ed out of Georgetown released a report that says that 52% of American Rescue Plan funds will go to staffing and academic recovery, whereas the balance has gone to expenses such as pandemic supplies, improving HVA systems, mental health, and of course, technology. While all available evidence suggests a once-in-a-century pandemic will require a multi-year recovery, we're starting to see promising results as well. For instance, in Tennessee, English language proficiency has returned to pre-pandemic levels in almost all grades, with more students scoring met or exceeding expectations than in 2019. In Texas, we saw a 9% point proficiency gain in ELA, certainly higher than 19. In fact, there are 10 states that are reporting on their state assessments. They're back to pre-pandemic levels in reading, and 4 states in mathematics. And certainly this year, with the release of results in fall, which we're looking forward to, this will be the first release of assessment results where every school division and district in our nation had a full year with the American Rescue Plan funds. And so whereas we feel really strongly that many of the things that you heard in the last speech are happening, that nearly every district is implementing tutoring programs, is implementing summer programs. One of the things that we're thinking about a lot is how can we make sure that this is done at the magnitude to make sure that we're having a recovery that is fast enough. And we've read some research. Certainly, many of you have probably heard some of this, or will be hearing about this today from Tom Kane at Harvard. But there are a lot of districts doing, say, 1 hour of tutoring a week with students that are facing a need for academic recovery. And we know that high dosage tutoring, and the research will say that students need 3 times that, as much as 3 hours a week or 100 hours a year to be able to recover in the timeline that we want to. And so our focus at the department is turning from making sure all the funds are getting out the door and into the hands of our teachers and principals so that they can impact students, And it's moving from making sure that they're spending it on the right things to making sure that they're actually doing it at the magnitude to make a difference before the funds expire. And so when we get to September, we'll have 1 year left with the American Rescue Plan funding. And so our push is on making sure that we're scaling the practices that are in place in the way that's necessary to make the difference. And it's a core part of the Secretary's ultimate strategic plan for the department, which is for us to raise the bar and lead the world on education. In fact, 2 of his goals focus directly on academics, one on accelerating learning, one on innovating instruction through a well-rounded education. And we're certainly doing everything we can to support states and districts on making that data more transparent and more available. I will mention that Connecticut, Ohio, and Washington all have fantastic public-facing dashboards and are hoping that many of our states will follow that. And that's why the department is here to help. We've launched the National Partnership for Student Success, which is calling on our nation to bring 250,000 more mentors and tutors into our schools, and the Engage Every Student initiative, which is focused on ensuring that every community has a robust out-of-school time and summer learning program. But at the department, we also are making our focus on ensuring that states are prioritizing the spending and doing it in a way that is acting with urgency and will have the most impact on our students. And obviously, we have a major role in accountability and monitoring. One of the things that we required from the onset of the plans that went out, every state and district is required to have a spending plan posted on their website of the American Rescue Plan funds and how they're going to be spent in their communities. And those were required to be created with meaningful stakeholder engagement. And so as we continue to move forward in monitoring our states, we're going to make sure that they are held accountable to the lawful and appropriate use of the funds, and while at the same time providing the technical assistance to make sure that they're aligning to the best and most evidence-based practices that we know about making a difference for our students. It's essential that we spend these funds well, because I believe that the decisions that we make with the American Rescue Plan could drive federal education funding for decades to come if we can prove that this historic and robust investment can truly make a difference in the lives of our students and help us recover from this pandemic. One of the things that Nicholas talked about that I thought was really interesting and that we're thinking about a lot is how should districts, after they have scaled up these practices and gotten the magnitude that we're looking for, how are they going to sustain these efforts after 2024? And that's one of the biggest things that we're thinking about as well. And we'll certainly be working with technical assistance for our states and districts on that. But I'll just mention a few ideas. Nicholas mentioned some ideas, one of those being, folding it into the core budget. But we have invested additional funds at the federal level in ongoing formula grant programs that we believe that can help with this sustainability goal that we all have for the work that we've launched during the American Rescue Plan. Since the beginning of the administration, we've increased Title I funding by nearly $2 billion, IDEA funding by another $1.5 billion, and we've increased funding for full service community schools 5-fold. In our next budget request, our 24 budget request, we call for another $2 billion in Title I and another $2.7 billion in IDEA. And so I would challenge our districts and states as they get these additional funds in Title I and IDEA to be thinking about how they can use those additional resources, which will be permanent and ongoing, to make sure that they sustain the efforts that they've launched. And when you think about efforts that have been launched in the area of student mental health and helping students recover from the trauma of the pandemic, we've also put out nearly $2 billion in Bipartisan Safer Communities Act funding. Now, this funding was passed in the wake of a tragic school shooting in Uvalde, Texas, but it was also there to make sure that we met the president's goal that he shared in the State of the Union 2 years ago to double the number of mental health professionals. Even with the first $1 billion that we rolled out in grants to increase the mental health pipeline, our grantees have committed to increasing the field with 14,000 more mental health professionals. And the other $1 billion that went out as a formula grant directly to states and districts will be there to make sure that they can scale the efforts that they already started in the American Rescue Plan, but continue to support the mental health of students in their schools while making their schools safer. And the great news is that funding, in large part, is still being competed by states to districts, and we'll have the opportunity to carry those funds even beyond the American Rescue Plan. The other thing that we're doing at the department to ensure sustainability of funding is we are being urgent and intense about the maintenance of equity and maintenance of effort requirements in the American Rescue Plan. Maintenance of effort essentially requires that the percentage of funding that the state expends on education must be maintained year over year throughout the American Rescue Plan. And maintenance of equity makes sure that high need school districts do not face disproportionate cuts. And with that work, we have been working diligently to make sure that all of our states and districts are compliant with that. And again, I mentioned some of our discretionary grant programs already, such as full service community schools, which we think are essential for providing the wraparound services to support students, not only in the pandemic, but in our schools at all times. But I'll also mention the recent launch of our EIR grant program, the Education, Innovation, and Research Program, which helps entities not only address front and center needs for our kids, but also provides a runway to test what works in addressing long-term and multi-pronged challenges. If you're thinking about doing innovation in your community or district, EIR is one of the most massive grant programs that can provide millions and millions of dollars to your community to make a difference. So I know I only had a few minutes here, and I'm excited about the work that we're doing with the American Rescue Plan at the federal level. We see the impact that states or districts are having with this money, and we see that we are on track to make a difference in helping our children recover from this pandemic. So with your partnership, I'm hopeful that we can support student academic and non-academic needs to truly raise the bar on student learning. I want to thank you for your time, and I'm so excited to be here today.
Thank you, Dr. Lane. I really appreciate hearing some of the positive news, even during some very challenging times. And I appreciate hearing the attention to the whole child, as we know that that's really who we need to keep in mind. Thank you for your time. Give you our best and a lot of gratitude for the work that the administration is doing.
Thank you.
With that, thank you. So with that, I'm going to turn it. I'm going to open it up to a conversation with Andrew and Peter. Dr. Lane and Nicholas have provided us with a lot of information, a lot of great promising practices, and some wonderful examples about how the work is doing. However, I want to take a little bit of time to kind of even narrow down the conversation more to hear about how the work has happened in your communities. You're representing two wonderful organizations, two wonderful communities in the New England area that Nellie Mae has been very fortunate to partner with. So let me start with Peter. Just want to hear a little bit more about how Young Voices has brought in community, and then especially the young people into this work.
Thanks, Delia. So back in 21, I think there was a bunch of organizations, I believe 7 of us, including the Latino Policy Institute, Alliance for Rhode Island, Southeast Asians for Education, Center for Youth and Community Leadership in Education, Rhode Island Kids Count, Rhode Island College, Center for Justice, and Young Voices. And I think for us, it was really important that, we felt that it is important to elevate youth voice in advancing racial equity in public education. And, we knew that youth were key stakeholders in determining the ESSER investments. And so for us, we wanted to first look at the dollars that were coming in, engage with it, create a fact sheet that would kind of break down the information for the community, and then look at promising practices, and then come up with a toolkit. So that for us was really critical, and that's kind of how we engaged the community in terms of the work that we're doing. But we really want to center youth voice. And so, for us, bringing young people to the table and centering their voices and giving them some ownership in terms of how we looked at this ESSER investment.
Peter, can you just offer a little bit about anything that the young people were talking about that might have surprised you?
I think that young people continue to identify key areas where there was need for education. And I think for folks, for young people being at the receiving end of education, I think they had identified a lot of barriers within just returning to the classroom after the pandemic, the lack of investment in mental health and social emotional learning, and just the other piece that they really stressed on was how quickly we jumped back into achieving the academic gap. And I think those were key areas that young people really identified when we had the conversation in terms of the ESSER, the investment, and returning back to the classroom.
Thank you. Andrew, I'm sorry. One of the things that really that I really appreciated. So when I started digging into the ESSER funding, personally, I found it very confusing. I found that for every document I read, there'd be at least another 15 links. And for someone like myself that's not into policy and has never dealt with billions of dollars, it was very daunting. So one of the many things I appreciated was the way people took information and made it more accessible, whether it was the toolkits or whether it was infographics, and then of course translated it into other languages. So can you give us a more of a glimpse into how you folks did that in Vermont and talk a little bit about the partnerships y'all have built?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Andrew Emmerich, and I work for Vermont NEA as the ARP coordinator. Prior to this role, I spent 11 years teaching kindergarten, and my last year in school was actually as a kindergarten interventionist, which was a new position that was created and funded by ESSER dollars. So I've actually seen firsthand the impact that these funds can have. In Vermont, when I started this position, it was very similar in the fact that there was a lot of information to get out there, documents that are 60 to 100 pages long, and trying to take that all in. Early on, I reached out to Education Justice Coalition of Vermont because I know they had been doing some great work speaking with community members and educating folks. We collaborated on several events that were open to the community to educate them about these funds, break down some of the more technical pieces into it, and really start to help form collaborations amongst different community groups to work together. Because when we have different organizations that are collaborating, there's really so much more strength in those numbers to advocate for what we need for our schools and for our students. I think our big priority was really creating awareness about these funds. Oftentimes when I chatted with folks, they would have a very basic understanding of ESSER funds, and they didn't really know how much their schools were getting or what the funds could be spent on or how schools were spending them. So that was our big priority, was trying to get them the ESSER 101 information.
Can you say more, Nicholas, around, I'm sorry, Andrew, I apologize. Can you say more around the importance of bringing in the educator's voice? We've talked a little bit about youth and parents, but what did you do to bring in the educator's voice, those that are in the classroom?
Yeah, I've been going around to all of our locals in Vermont and speaking to union leadership to provide them with presentations on how much money their schools received, what their current allocations are, some other grant opportunities that have been out there and available outside of ESSER funds as well. And I know we spoke earlier about meaningful consultation, and there's a variety of stakeholders that needed to be consulted. Making sure that staff and teachers and other educators have their voices heard is so important, because they're the ones that are working with students on a day in, day out basis. The bus driver is the first person who picks up that student in the morning and the last one to drop them off. And their input is so valuable into seeing the impact from this traumatic pandemic on our students. They know what it is that our students need and what our schools need, and their voices are critical in this process.
Can you give us any examples of things that they offered as areas for support?
Yeah, each local is really really unique in their own needs. There are several locals that have major HVAC concerns that have been advocating hard to make sure that they have safe and healthy air quality for their students and for anybody that walks into that building. A lot of other locals have been pushing hard to make sure that they have the staffing that they need. It's great if you have a bunch of brand new computers for students to use, but if you don't have any educators and staff there to help teach them how to use these tools, that computer is not going to be worth anything at all. So lots of big push for making sure that students have the staff they need ready to work with them from day one.
Thank you. So, in hearing Dr. Lane, he spoke about how much of the funds have already been spent and that things are moving at a faster pace. But there was also almost like a cautionary tale, I think, from Nicholas saying, if things aren't working the way we would hope that they would, it is okay to think about how you redirect those dollars, right? So I'm curious, what advice would both of you give to communities that are hearing this webinar and are thinking about how they might start to advocate in their communities for greater community engagement, greater youth engagement, and are really just starting to monitor the spending of the funds? What advice would you give them? There's still time to get into it. So just curious. And we'll start with you, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to what Andrew was starting off with, I think the awareness is really important. So raising awareness among just the general public. So if you go, I could say here in Providence and Rhode Island, if you just talk to any person, the general public, there is a higher chance that they'll say, I don't know what those dollars are. So I think there is a critical need for us to be able to raise awareness and education and build knowledge, because, from an organizing perspective, people will only show up if they have the information and they understand what that information is. I do think that we need to continue to press, districts on spending and allocations. I think that's really critical. I could just throw out, for example, here in Providence, the last time the district hosted something for ESSER dollars was February 14th, 2022. And that was a webinar, right? And that's over a year ago. And we've got, September 20th, it's September 30th looming. I think, it is critical for us to be able to access that information. One, just for transparency, just to see how that funding has been spent in previous years, and then what is going to be allocated between, 23, 24, and 24, 25 school year. Recently Annenberg came out with their report, and it's sad to say that Rhode Island ranks in the bottom 5 on how ESSER dollars have been spent. And so, I think it's really important that we continue to raise awareness within our communities, continue to mobilize, engage families, community members, students in particular, and just, bring out folks so that we can continue to advocate and push and organize for how the ESSER investment can be critical to moving our education forward.
Andrew, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Peter hit on a really important piece there, that a lot of that consultation happened a long time ago. And the funds came out quickly, and schools were under pressure of figuring out how to allocate these funds, following all of the rules of getting this money spent properly while also operating the schools. There was, some good efforts I saw by some schools in Vermont. Montpelier Roxbury held several different listening sessions. They had an LGBTQIA+ space facilitated by an organization in Vermont. They had a listening session for those who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And they also had a listening session for families with students with IEP plans or that have neurodivergent needs. And those are really amazing ways to engage with the community. I would love to see those types of practices be ongoing, not just one-time things, but something that really should be continuing, and making sure that people, once they're aware of these funds, educating them on how they've been spent and letting them know the impact they've had, because I think many of us have spoken today about the need for sustainability going forward after 2024, and having good information out to the public is going to be really critical in ensuring that we have funding moving forward.
Thank you. I think what I hear is also a call for transparency and the sustainability. And I think, like a lot of policies, once you win them, somebody has to make sure that they're implemented, right? So even like we have the funds now, but how do we know that they're implemented in a way that's going to benefit young people? Nicholas, I'm going to ask you to join us, and we're going to bring up a couple questions that have come to us. And again, this is a wonderful time for folks to continue sending questions via the Q&A. So I'm going to start with this question, and my hunch, Nicholas, that this is probably going to be directed at you, but actually I open it to anyone. So the question is, how much funding has gone to the redesign of instructional models? And if you don't have the exact number, give us an idea of what you've seen happening.
Yeah, that's a good question. If anyone else has any answers, feel free to jump in. I will attempt to answer this. I would say generally it's hard to sort of get a good sense of how much money is going to that specific area, only because I feel like redesigning instructional models can sort of span a lot of different spending categories and how they would be reporting. Like that could be focused on potentially how we're staffing schools, or it could be sort of like how we're thinking about redesigning the schedule, and all those things are really important and things that schools are doing. Particularly, we've seen a lot of schools being really intentional about redesigning the schedule to fit tutoring into the regular school day. So that's a particularly important and I think sort of relatively prevalent practice when it comes to this. But again, that's not even something that really involves a lot of funding per se. That's just sort of being intentional and being thoughtful about planning when it comes to the spending.
So Delia, it's not a percentage, but if you look at the recent Edinburgh report that was sent out, in terms of ESSER personnel funding, most of it has gone towards paying existing staff members, both to cover additional responsibilities and to pay for recurring salary costs. And then it did mention that like districts have invested about 20% of ESSER personnel spending into substitute teachers and contract personnel to address the short-term instructional and well-being. So that's the piece that's coming out of Rhode Island right now.
Thank you. And that was quite the report. So thank you, Peter. I might follow up with you with the question about that in a minute, but let me go to the next one, and then because I do have some curiosities about that. Andrew, anything you want to say on this question?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I don't have a percentage in Vermont, but I do know there's lots of money that went towards hosting remote academies for schools, money that was spent on hiring substitute teachers with the intention of some release time for staff to work on collaborative planning together, thinking about the impacts of the pandemic. I've seen lots and lots of money invested in staffing positions. There's been several schools that have gone away from a multi-grade level approach to get one teacher for first grade, one teacher for second grade, in an attempt to have smaller staff class sizes and make a larger impact there.
Thank you. I'm going to move to the second question. How are the ESSER funds used to address the whole child? I think Dr. Lane kind of started speaking to this. Beyond standardized test scores, are any districts using these funds to address mental and social emotional health issues that we know are very prevalent? So curious to hear what's gone on in your community. And Nicholas, what do you know from your standpoint?
Yeah, I'll jump us off here. I know that we had one district that made a major investment in teletherapy services that was available for not just students, but staff as well, which has been really, really impactful and supports so many students. We have another district that has been getting professional development from an organization called Outright Vermont, which is supporting educators in working with students that identify as LGBTQ+. And so really trying to think about supporting all students who have been impacted by the pandemic here.
Yeah, I would say nationally there has been a very large push to be addressing mental health. We know that students have been impacted by sort of just being at home, not in school, particularly trauma to losing family members to the pandemic as well has been a big impact. I think Andrew's right in pointing out sort of mental health, sort of telehealthing services for folks. I also think lots of schools and districts have been trying to invest in hiring additional counselors. I think the biggest struggle there has really been the availability of counselors. So I think this the telehealth is actually a really big option, a really important option. Folks are also focusing on providing training for staff, particularly educators, to make sure that they are creating welcoming environments for students, which I think is really important, particularly as we're trying to address the sort of really high rates of chronic absenteeism that have resulted since the pandemic.
Thank you. And I'm curious, and again, we have time for another question if someone wants to share another question via the Q&A. I'm curious about, you mentioned, Nicholas, I think it was Nashville and Texas. You mentioned a couple places where there are models for this work. Can you tell us a little bit more about how did they get to that point? Like, what can we learn from those locations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say when we're thinking about promising practices and sort of implementing them, there's a couple of really important things to be thinking about. One is having an understanding of what the research says, like what is the evidence that actually will drive the impacts that you want to see for students. There are some clear research, particularly when it comes to tutoring, about sort of what works and what actually doesn't work. So not all tutoring is really, you can say you're doing tutoring, but if you're not sort of following the exact best practices, you're not going to get the results that you want. The other really important thing that I mentioned earlier was engaging students and families, as well as community-based organizations within your district, within your school community, to make sure that the services that you're providing are actually meeting the needs of the students and families in your community, rather than just sort of guessing what those needs are. Sort of actually getting a sense of what students' families need is going to be really important to make sure you're actually addressing those needs. And then the other piece that I would say is really being which sort of I think ties into both of these, is sort of being slow and thoughtful at the very beginning about the design of the program, not just sort of like rushing in and being like, all right, we have this great idea, we're going to spend this money in this way, and just like doing it as fast as possible. Being really thoughtful about sort of what are the actual pieces of this program that we need to do, how can we do them thoughtfully, and then also as a part of that work, know where you want to end up and what are the things that you need to be looking at along the way to make sure you're going to get there. And I would say the places that we talked to that sort of were showing promise did all of those things.
Thank you.
And Julie, I think
yeah,
if I could
go
just
ahead,
jump in real quickly, just to respond earlier too. I think this is why it's critical for the transparency of like spending and investment, because to answer the question, we don't necessarily, there's no reports that are coming out that really specify. So then we have to just kind of generalize in terms of like, okay, there is money going to curriculum, there is funding going into, student supports, and then there is funding going into, the physical well-being of the buildings and so forth. So I think the accountability piece, the spending report for what has been spent and what is being allocated really becomes, hypercritical in terms of like how we can actually look at where this money has been spent, and then kind of looking at it from like, is this an investment, or is this was just, kind of a band-aid for something that was urgent?
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I also think about all the different players that are involved. And someone just offered a question, which will be our last question before we move to the closing. So the question is, what are the best ways to help make education leaders aware of useful resources and solutions to invest in? Given the overwhelming nature of the information documents, et cetera, being given to school leaders, what are the best ways to reach out in a way that is helpful and not overwhelming? That is so key. So can folks offer some ideas of how they either work with district administrators, or in retrospect, what some way that they could also be supported to wrap their heads around this information?
Yeah, I think one thing that's really important is just recognizing that we all want to see our public schools succeed. People are not using these funds in nefarious ways or with evil intentions. I think we are really all on the same page that public education is the backbone of democracy, and we want more community members to speak up and have their voices heard. So sending out an email or setting up time, in-person conversations are such a nice way to communicate with people so nothing gets lost in that text from an email. So finding time to sit down with your school board and have these conversations, or setting up time to meet with your superintendent, I think is a great first step. And there is lots of information out there, and these funds are so flexible, they can be spent on a variety of things. So really thinking specifically about your school and your community, and maybe where some gaps have been in the past from our schools not being fully funded, where are some items that we want to see this money really make a difference, and narrowing it down.
Something I wanted to spotlight, so I'll take my work hat off and put on my my personal hat as a parent in the district for Providence. Something that I've noted that they've done really well is they've ran these parent university sessions, and they send out information. You receive it via text. All of the information is accessible on their website. However, when you go through the website and so forth, none of it has really pertained to ESSER. And I think this is where, they have some platforms, they have some tools, continue to expand on that. I think we need to continue to invite the community, all the different stakeholders. Trust is really important in our work. And we also need to remember that, we have to build trust with our community. We can't just keep saying, well, we've done X, Y, and Z and stop. So I think those are, to me, I think, there are some things that are going well. Look to Central Falls with their participatory budgeting exercises. There are things that are existing that are doing pretty well. And I think we have to take away the narrative that this is a one-time money and we can't rely on it because, it's going to run out, but more so being, hopeful in the sense that, hey, this is an investment. How can we make it a sound investment so that we can invest in a framework that's more sustainable for our education system.
Peter, I so appreciate those words. Thank you so much. It is easier to sometimes see the negative, but it is, and the word opportunity and the pandemic don't go together. But this is one of those very odd moments. We have run out of time, so I'm going to close this out in a minute, but I do want to put out a question that we will not answer right now. The question is around how do you get funding to do this work, right? I'm going to urge any funder that's on the call to think about it. And this is really one of the reasons we wanted to do this call. There is still time, there is still money. And I hope other foundations, and just want to mention, we did this in partnership with the Bar Foundation. So it does take a village to carry out this work, and very, very happy. But before we close out, I would like to thank a few people. Our panelists, thank you all so much. Dr. Lane in the Department of Education, Paul, our IT person at Ellie Mae, and a very special thanks to Julita Bailey Vasco, Acting Chief of Communications at Ellie Mae. And it really, she really is the one that is the magic sauce behind this EdEquityTalks. There's a couple more coming up. Ask y'all to stay tuned. And then finally, as the story of the pandemic's impact on our society, and especially on our children, continues to unfold, I'm going to encourage all of us to contribute to a story that shows that we really did rally around our children, that we use unprecedented funds to respond to their social, emotional, and academic needs. And for once, as somebody said to me early into the pandemic, for once, we cannot say we don't have the funds. And I think just ending on a very simple note, I would say, let's go make lemonade. And then let's figure out how we sustain that lemonade. I want to thank everyone who took time from their busy days to join us. This is really an equity conversation. And if we're going to support the young people who have been poorly served in many ways, this is that opportunity to use the money wisely and to think about the follow-up to it. But thank you again. Look forward to chatting another time. Take care, everybody. Have a great day. Thank you. Bye-bye.